this was certainly true in China, but even true in Japan and Korea. There wasn't much cultural integration in these territories. If you travel 20 kilometers, people spoke very different dialects. If you traveled even a bit more, people began to eat different kinds of food. Right? And so to the extent that people had a sense of what is common was usually confined to a small village, or perhaps even a region. Everything else was foreign. So the very idea of being Japanese culture, or Korean culture, or Vietnamese culture, or Chinese culture would have made very little sense. There was Chinese civilization, meaning Chinese characters and Chinese classics, but that was shared by all the intellectual elites in East Asia, and something that was not shared by and large by the vast majority of the population. So what happens then is that basically in East Asia, there was no sense of being kind of united people, sense of having Chinese people who lived in Chinese society, Koreans who lived in Korean Peninsula, Japanese who lived in Japanese archipelago, and so on. And even more, whether you went to Northeast Asia or Southeast Asia, there was just a great deal of diversity. So the very idea of putting these categories would have made no sense. It only existed kind of as an elite intellectual category. It wasn't the case for the vast majority of the population. So as I mentioned, for 80–90% of the population, essentially any idea of culture, society, civilization just made no sense. And what's really interesting is that in mainland China, this process of cultural integration has been happening really seriously only from roughly the mid-20th century. Essentially with the communist takeover, the Communist Party tries to spread mass schooling, universal schooling, so that everywhere you go in China today, you can speak Mandarin and more or less get by. But this was not really the case until quite recently. And still today, essentially, 600 to 800 million people in mainland live in ways that were so different from the way their ancestors lived. Not so, very, very long time ago. That is to say, one of the great dramas happening in mainland is that roughly 40–50% of the population in Chinese mainland are entering the world in which we live, this kind of Eurocentric modern world. Once I was invited to take part in an interdisciplinary multinational research group. The reason was that there's a lot of complaint that most of the social science, as I have been complaining, is too nationalist and ethnocentric, and it's too narrow disciplinary. So they said, well, what would happen if we bring people from different disciplines, different nations, and let them study something? And so we went to, there were 6 of us, I think, 8 of us, 6 to 8 of us, I can't remember exactly, 8 of us actually, who took this microbus to Shanxi province, into the countryside. It was not a very good idea because a lot of people actually didn't speak Mandarin, personally, so that was a problem. But, I mean, it's kind of a stupid story, but there was an Indian anthropologist from India, and she insisted that she had to use toilet, flush toilet, like bathrooms. And in this countryside, this was about 10 years ago, there just weren't toilets. So the first day, we drove around looking for toilets. It's a really stupid story, but it's indicative of how little people understand the countryside in China. Second day, I'm sure many of you know, but that region of China, people don't eat rice, right? I mean, you have to go to tourist restaurants. So if you go to the countryside in this province, they're only noodles. I mean, it's a cold area, so they only grow wheat. So the Japanese, I think, sociologist, I forget what he was, but this Japanese guy said, I mean, it's really hard to believe, but I need to eat rice. Because come to China, right? He thinks Chinese all eat rice, right? Because Japanese people think that Chinese eat rice. Anyway, like Americans. And so he had spent some time and he had not eaten rice in like 3 days. And just couldn't stand it. So we spent the whole day looking for rice. So it kind of went like that. So anyway, the only point about this is not to talk about how foolish social scientists are, but more to say how foreign this place, which is only about 550 kilometers from Beijing, it was for most people. It's a 1 hour plane ride to Taiwan. You drive 1 hour away, it's a foreign world. Couldn't find toilets, couldn't find rice, couldn't find Mandarin speakers. It's a serious problem. So basically, that's the world that existed in East Asia. I mean, there are of course exceptions. If you went to Beijing or Edo or Tokyo, it was a very urban, cosmopolitan place in many ways. But for vast majority of people, they lived in the small universe of their village, speaking their local dialect, eating their local food, wearing their local clothes, and so on. And so the very idea of using these very homogenizing categories, like talking about Chinese society, as if there were common denominators, would have made almost no sense. Not just this cultural diversity, but also this vast difference in status. Literati, intellectuals in China were not the same kind of people as peasants. They're just different kinds of people. So basically you have a situation in which there was just a profound heterogeneity, profound difference in divergence. That's why it would have made no sense to talk about being Japanese, Korean, or Chinese 200 years ago. There wasn't that much commonality. And this makes a lot of sense, because if you are in most of these places several hundred years ago, there wasn't much transportation. I mean, today, because of the high-speed railway network, you can go from Taipei to Kaohsiung in an hour and a half, I heard. But when I was here 16 years ago, I was kind of making people laugh because someone said, why don't you come to Kaohsiung? And I said, oh my God, it's so far away. but because 16 years ago, actually it was far away. It took forever to get there, for me, right? So I had this memory that I spent the whole day, more than one day, getting to Kaohsiung, Taipei. But today, you go there in 90 minutes. But even before there were cars, right? People just could only travel at the speed of 3 horses at its fastest. There's a very interesting study people have done on various revolutions. So in terms of American Revolution, so Declaration of Independence is declared in Philadelphia, eastern part of the U.S., right, in 1776. And the most western city in the U.S. back then was Cincinnati, which is in Ohio. If you look at the map of the U.S., it seems to be really on the eastern part of the U.S., right? Because West U.S. is huge, but it's still called the Midwest, because back then, U.S. really ended at Mississippi. So it was the West. Anyway, so the news of the declaration took 44 days to get from Philadelphia to Cincinnati. Today, it's a 1 hour plane ride. But even better, with communication network from 1830s, right, once telegraph was invented and people began to put telegraph lines, the news became instantaneous. And that was really one of the fundamental breaks of modernity. I mean, we talk about the internet connecting the world, and of course it does. But if you think about before telegraph, the news of Declaration of Independence took 44 days from Washington, D.C., not Washington, D.C., Philadelphia to Cincinnati. But after the 1830s, by 1840s, was one, just instantaneous. The news just like that. And so that is one of the fundamental breaks. But in any case, so in that kind of society, social life, where it's hard to move things, it's hard to transport people, things, and news, it's not that surprising this diversity continues. Without having radio, you just don't understand what the standard pronunciation of words are. So you speak in local dialects. And there's a very famous story about the founder of Samsung in Korea. He came from southeastern part. Korea is a very small place, relatively speaking. But there's a famous story where he talks about how in 1920s, he comes from a village in southeast, some part of South Korea. Today you can get there in 2 hours by train. Comes to Seoul. And he said it took him about 3 or 4 months to understand what people were saying. Because the dialects were so different, the school system didn't exist, really. The Japanese started building them, but he wasn't very wealthy at the time, so he didn't go to Japanese schools. And so the Korean he spoke was so different that he said it took him months to really understand what people in Seoul were saying. And of course, added to this is the point I've been making about status. So it's not surprising then, right, that when people start talking about tradition, it's actually a modern phenomenon. Because there was no one coherent entity.
I'm sorry, just to clarify.
Before?
The status disintegration.
Oh my God, I'm doing something wrong.
Yeah, that.
Okay. Oh yeah, it's just the point that if you were a landlord, you didn't think that peasants were the same kind of people. It's this idea that in the U.S., if you're Bill Gates or if you're a homeless person, both people think that they are Americans, and Bill Gates will not deny that this homeless person is an American, right? Because they belong to the same society. But back then, people didn't think like that. They were different kinds of people. The idea that you would say they're the same kind of people would have been abhorrent. So instead, what happens is that I'm now talking about nationalist and traditionalist ideas. The reason they don't work is because the past was so radically different. Tradition kind of assumes that there's this coherent entity that moves through time. So China 300 years ago must have been roughly the same. They were just slightly different. They wore different clothes, perhaps, and so on. But basically, there was something like Chinese society or Japanese society or Korean society, and then it evolves or changes through time, flows through time. But this is completely wrong, because the past was so radically different. You can talk about China having really existed as we think of it today, or even Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan's a very different case, I suppose, like Korea or Japan. So what traditional thought, what these nationalist thoughts do, is fundamentally misrecognize the past. They want to project our image of social life into the past and want to say there's a straight line leading from Ming China, for example, to today's China, or from Heian period in Japan, or Koryo period in Korea to present day Japan and Korea. But to me, it makes almost no sense, because there were no societies as such. So this is why I keep on insisting that it's quite curious that nationalists think they're being traditionalists or nativists, because they are using this Western categories and merely putting just weird ideas into them. So in fact, what one needs to do is, again, take seriously the idea of path dependence and just look for more recent factors to make sense of the present. Because the farther back you go, I think in general, the less powerful it is as an explanation. I think the point I'm trying to make, I don't know, people think I'm obsessed with body shape. Because I always talk about thin people and not so thin people. But I think it's like one of the ways to think about obesity, because it's very interesting to me, is that it's actually, if you're thin, it takes a long time to be obese. Because to have a lot of weight requires that you have a lot of calorie intake. And so if you are shaped like Jialing, you have to really work hard to eat a lot every day, right? And you can't be a fat overnight. And it's a bit like that. If you're going to be China, you can't just assume that there's this thing that goes through unchanged or relatively unchanged time. That has to change to become China today. And so to understand China today, you need to look for more recent steps. So anyway, the main point I'm trying to make, I think, is that a lot of nationalist ideas are ideological in the sense that they want to naturalize something that is not natural at all. There is nothing Chinese that is unchanging over time, just as much as there is no Koreanness or Japaneseness. And the more you kind of probe into the past, the quicker you realize that there is nothing unchanging. Since, I don't know, Koreans are the ones today, South Koreans, who are most nationalists probably. So, one of the things I like to say when I go to Korea and lecture is that, I'll talk about more of this later, but what's interesting about South Korea is South Koreans have no modern heroes. So if you look at currencies, money, right? When you go to the mainland, it's all Mao Zedong, all currencies, same guy, because he was very important. In the case of Korea, everyone comes from the 16th century. Everyone. There's no one after 16th century. But what's interesting is that, so many Koreans think that kind of the essence of being Korean is kimchi. These pickles that Koreans like to eat, spicy, right? But the reason kimchi became spicy, of course, is that they started using red chili peppers. But red chili peppers come from South America. They're not native to East Asia. And they really started coming to Korean Peninsula roughly in the 17th century. So I often like to say that there are no important Koreans who ate real kimchi. So maybe they're not really Koreans. So it's like, a point like that, that they think that everything is the same, but no, everything is different. Okay, so to get back to the point I was making about how East Asia becomes more like the image of Western society that Western social theorists projected. And so over time, they become more convincing to people in East Asia. And I want to argue very quickly that there were three forces that made East Asia look like the kind of society Western social theory talked about. Three forces that kind of integrate East Asia. The first is something I already talked about, namely kind of the uniform impact of Japan. That Japan simply becomes the major way in which the modern comes, the West comes. And when you then ask, why Japan? Right? There's actually a very bizarre answer, actually. I mean, question is, why did Japan play this role? Why not China? Why not Korea? Why not Vietnam? The reason I would actually argue is that both Qing dynasty and Joseon dynasty were actually much stronger than the Tokugawa regime. Because what happens in mid-19th century all across East Asia, and this is a very, very interesting topic, is that there's a series of peasant rebellions. So each of the major East Asian societies, as we think of it, goes through a major crisis. The peasants are rebelling throughout the realm. And in many ways, ironically, we think of Qing and Joseon as being weak and decadent, in decline, but it's precisely because they were stronger that they survived peasant rebellions much better than the Tokugawa regime. So Tokugawa, right, the Edo period in Japan, comes to a quick end, in part because the Tokugawa regime was very good. And paradoxically then, it's the weakest regime that had the weakest impact of Chinese thought that become the first modernizing East Asian society. The point I'm making is that both in terms of ability to withstand social change, in terms of politics or social change, and in terms of intellectual life, it's precisely the weakness of Japan, right, that made it easier to accept the West. Both in Qing China and Joseon Korea, there were these large group of literati or intellectuals who wanted to resist peasants on the one hand and the West on the other, and clung on to the older style of Chinese thinking. So what does Japan provide? Well, it provides almost everything that East Asian societies later come to accept. The most important, of course, is the belief that the key to survival in modern era is militarization along Western lines, which meant the necessity of industrialization, to build weapons, and infrastructural development. You need to build roads, communication, and of course, to educate the population. And this becomes a state project, a government project, and was done largely top-down. And the Japanese model becomes the model for everyone in East Asia. You teach the masses this thing, both modern, Western, and you try to create these Western things like roads, telegraph, universities, tanks, planes, cars, what have you. So even in terms of business, this was most true in the case of Japan and Korea, obviously, but in many ways, state becomes very involved in business enterprises. Again, kind of top-down. And in the case of Japan, of course, colonialism becomes the main way in which they try to show that they're truly Western. So what are the consequences? Well, everywhere you see a very compressed development. If you go to England today, say you go to take a plane to Heathrow and drive towards London, many of the architectures look like houses in the movie version of Shakespeare's plays. And many people actually think that they must have been built recently to look like old things. But no, actually, a lot of these houses actually have been there for 500 years. If you tell anyone in Japan or Korea, or of course Taiwan, a building has been there for 500 years, how is that possible? It's another stupid story, but I had a friend who lives in California, and California is the newest part, right, of continental U.S. It's a very young state in American context. And so he came to Japan, where I was at the time. And we together went to this person's house. And this person spoke English, not perfectly, but very well, this Japanese scholar. And so the house looked new. So this guy from California said, how old is this house? And so the Japanese guy said, 3 years old. And so the guy said, 30 years old. I said, no, 3 years old. So he kept on saying, 30 years old. Because for someone from California, the very idea the house is new was so strange. Because everything is old, right? Even in California. In any case, the point I'm trying to make is that, so whereas in the West, right, even in America, where everything is supposed to be new, it happens much more slowly. So houses, so the house I live in California, in Berkeley, was built in 1924. 1924. And if I tell people in Japan that I live in a house built in 1924, people say that's crazy. It's going to break down any moment. Right? And it's true in Korea too. They can think of any house anyone lives in that was built in 1924. That doesn't exist. And I'm sure that's the case in Taiwan. I'm sure there's something from 1924, but it's a rarity. And true in China too. And it's because development is compressed. You break down everything and build it new. And so the pace is highly accelerated. And more importantly, people think nothing about destroying tradition and of course the environment as well. So again, the English example is very good. The first country to experience industrialization. If you actually go from London to Manchester, Manchester was kind of the center of British industrialization. It's all green. It's countryside. Yes, there are factories, but it's surrounded by these green parks and rivers. And so for especially people from mainland China, they think this is like a country resort. Even though Manchester was this massive industrial city that people thought was so strange. These factories and chimneys and black smoke. But no, because it happened very slowly. In East Asia, what happened in England over a 300-year period, 250-year period, happens in 50 to 100 years. So everything is compressed. And one of the reasons that it's accelerated and compressed is that they had what you might call advantage of backwardness. Because by the time Korea, China, Taiwan, or even Japan began to industrialize, they had choice of models. You didn't have to just copy England. You could have copied from Germany or France. So when Koreans built subway, actually it was a really stupid idea, but they got models from Japan, France, England, in creating their subway system. So it didn't work very well. Instead of just borrow from one. And more importantly, of course, they had strong justification for doing that. And of course, it's not that East Asia didn't have long tradition of powerful center, top-down rule, and so on. In fact, they were not as extreme as we think of it today. The best way to talk about this is to make a distinction between, I forgot to put this, in infrastructural power and despotic power. So these are two forms of power. Despotic power is very easy. It's the king saying, and in France, for example, in 18th century, the king basically had more or less the right to say something like, I don't like the way you're not listening to me. I'm going to send you to jail. And the king could do that, right? Because he was the king. You're sleeping during my lecture. I'm going to arrest you and kill you, right? Hang you. You're a bad person. That's despotic power. But we know that the king in France, even though he had this tremendous power in one sense, despotic power, had almost no infrastructural power, meaning that he couldn't collect taxes. Why? Because he didn't have bureaucracy. He just had few people, who stood guard and so on. If you are President Obama today, as you know, he has, in some ways, very little despotic power.